At last, the long-awaited day had finally arrived. The project had already been uploaded to the laptop, the battery was fully charged, the virus scan was complete, and they had ensured that the file opened without any issues. Thus, the presentation could have been prepared even in their sleep. The man could synchronize his speech with the slides almost down to the second. For this reason, they could finally say with confidence that they were ready for anything. His partners reacted to this news in various ways, each according to their own nature. The most indecisive among them noted that she was terribly afraid there might be a mistake somewhere, so it might be wise to check the code one more time. However, the woman standing beside her was clearly outraged at the mere suggestion that her code could contain any kind of error. It seriously irritated her that her work was being considered problematic and potentially in need of replacement. 6 months ago, they and their friends had founded this company. Among them was Park Dong-ga, who was a programmer, Choi Sinja, who was a planning specialist, and Moon Haji, who was responsible for design. Then there was An Yang, who wasn't quite sure what to call his own position. There was also someone else among them, the one who had brought them together when there was a chance they might fall apart. People said that Nam Mina had been invited to a major company after patenting something, and that was the reason she was called. However, it was known that she had declined their offer because she was in the process of creating her own software development company. People had mixed feelings about this news, but it was hard to deny that with her skills, this wouldn't be a difficult task, and if everything worked out, it would be far better than toiling away for someone else. As soon as one of them heard this, they immediately wanted to work for her as a programmer. But it was clear that someone like her didn't need just anyone. And if she were to recruit someone, it would definitely have to be someone exceptionally talented. The girl at the center of all this gossip was his good friend, Nam Mina. One fine day, she suggested to her friends that they create their own company, with their first project being the development of a mobile app for marketing departments. The salary would be paid monthly, and after the completion of projects, they could expect bonuses. The initial reaction to this proposal was rather skeptical. Few believed in the success of such a venture, and in general, it wasn't clear how they could contribute with their specific skill sets. While they didn't all know each other well, everyone knew Nam Mina. After all, everyone present was highly talented in their respective fields, and that was precisely why they had been chosen. Besides, she didn't enjoy working with failures. Moreover, all of them were too socially awkward. If they were to work with other people, even in a small company, she could guarantee that the stress would drive them to quit soon enough, so this offer was an excellent opportunity. In this, she was absolutely right. They all had some psychological issues. Finally, An Yang intervened, stating that, as someone who had known Mina for a long time, he could firmly say that she was not the kind of person to sugarcoat her words. However, she always spoke her mind, saying exactly what she thought. They might not have known each other well, and perhaps had only crossed paths a few times. But the fact that she wanted to start this venture with them showed just how much she valued their abilities. Besides, no one had ever seen this girl fail at anything she set her mind to, and even back in kindergarten, all her endeavors had been wildly successful. Therefore, they couldn't simply turn her down. This was their golden ticket to a better life. Suddenly, Moon Haji asked if she could draw some cats. The cheerful and energetic girl wanted to turn all the characters into cats. Park Dong-ga saw potential in this idea and was ready to hear more. And so they created the company together, without having any idea what the future held for them. They rented a garage near their college for their office and moved everything they needed there. It wasn't just Mina. Everyone was excellent at what they did, so the project progressed rapidly. Only An Yang was left to handle cleaning, bookkeeping, and fetching food, but he also had to oversee the project's readiness. However, things didn't always go as smoothly as they hoped. Whenever he asked about some element, everyone felt obliged to explain it to him in the simplest terms. What was obvious to others wasn't always clear to the protagonist, as he had never dealt with such matters before. Nevertheless, their leader decided that the icon needed to be changed. After all, the specialists for whom the program was designed wouldn't understand these subtleties either. Perhaps their reaction would be the same as Anyang's. Her reasoning sounded quite logical, considering that the company had existed for a long time, yet had never bothered with such details. As expected from this team, they quickly found a solution to the issue at hand. By now, the protagonist was convinced that these people were extraordinary, and their program was bound to be a hit. After all, working together as a close-knit team, they could achieve anything. Everyone was certain that their work would soon be recognized worldwide, until they encountered a problem. One day, Mina announced that they would have to abandon the project, as her father's company had gone bankrupt. However, there was no need to worry about her parents, as they always had a backup plan. Still, she was now reconsidering the offer from L Electronics, which she had turned down for the sake of this venture. The salary and signing bonus would be enough to prevent her parents' property from being seized, but it also meant she wouldn't be able to pay her team. Pak immediately declared that she didn't care about the salary. She had no intention of abandoning the work they had already done. But even if the pay wasn't a priority for them, Mina had no choice but to leave the project, as she would be tied up with the other company for at least a few months. The question now was whether they could make decisions in the final stages and present the project to the executives without her. No one gave her an answer, just as she had expected, so she had no choice but to leave, as she had other matters to attend to. Still, before departing, she apologized for how things had turned out. The first to show emotion, surprisingly, was Pak, and it was Yang who stepped up, suggesting that they finish the project on their own. After all, the demo version was almost complete. All that remained was to finalize the design, check the code for errors, and prepare a solid presentation. The man was ready to handle the presentation, confident that he could do it just as well as Mina. Maybe that's why they had included him in the team in the first place. He hadn't even finished speaking when others began to support the idea. After all, they could fill the void left by Mina by tapping into more of their own potential. In the end, the rest of the team embraced this mindset, and that's how they overcame the crisis. Even without Mina, they were now standing on the verge of success. Then, at last, the morning of the presentation arrived, and everyone was as nervous as they could be. Sensing the need to calm the team, who were already on edge, Yang quipped that if they didn't pull themselves together, he'd have to tie them up and drag them to the presentation. Given each person's temperament, his words had the desired effect. Suddenly, everyone found some urgent reason why they couldn't attend the presentation alongside him. In any case, the time had come for the long-awaited presentation of all their hard work. One way or another, they had all done their part brilliantly, and the rest was now up to him. Though he felt uncomfortable in his business suit, fortunately, he was quite adept at giving presentations and knew how to speak in a way that kept people engaged. He had established rapport with his professors using the same approach. Yet he had to admit that all his skills were still those of a student. Given the place he had to present at now, he wasn't entirely sure if his abilities would be enough to impress the executives of such a company. Eventually, the protagonist arrived at the place where he was to give the presentation, and they showed him where everything he needed was set up. He was also reminded that the presentation had been allotted no more than 15 minutes. Since preparation didn't require much time, they decided to bring in the executives. While the protagonist was left alone, in a flurry of cable organizing, he unconsciously crawled under the table. This allowed him to overhear the dissatisfied voices of the executives as they entered, complaining that nothing worthwhile had ever come from these presentations. They were simply hoping to snatch up a few profitable ideas. But in the end, everything turned out to be terribly dull. Amidst their grumbling, they didn't notice the guest emerging from under the table. Realizing this, they were forced to apologize for their remarks, as they hadn't noticed when he had appeared. In the end, they were merely here to observe, while the final decision would be made by director Kang Daehyung. That name suddenly triggered a flood of memories for Yang, as Mina had mentioned him before. She had asked him to remember the name, as he had been personally hired by the company's head to modernize their image and rid them of their outdated reputation. And it was no wonder. This man worked miracles despite his young age. His management style was sharp, his orders unquestionable, and every company he touched saw skyrocketing results, making him highly sought after. Just the thought of him sent chills down Yang's spine. This was the person making the decisions, their primary target to impress. During the presentation, special attention had to be paid to him. Scanning the room, the protagonist tried to pick out the elusive director. As he searched, someone introduced Director Khan, who had just entered the room. This man stood out distinctly from everyone else present. It was almost impossible to look away from this strikingly charismatic man. Yet Yang decided to introduce himself directly, apologizing for his boldness as they hadn't even met yet. But despite everything, he couldn't help but feel the urge to ask him out on a date. It turned out that all of this was nothing more than a daydream, while the others continued yawning, waiting for the presentation to start. Perhaps the attraction was no surprise, and Director Khan was certainly his type. But now was clearly not the time to confuse fantasy with reality. In any case, he was invited to begin if he was ready. Hearing the director's words, An Yang realized he needed to pull himself together. Too much was riding on the next few minutes. He had to focus and start calmly, beginning with the basics. On the screen was Tofu, their main character. They had chosen him as the central theme, not only because the SJ Corporation had started with tofu, but also because this product was still beloved throughout the country. This idea resonated with the executives, as they remembered how Chairman Song himself had once made tofu on a stone mill. It was true. They wanted to create a character that, at first glance, would immediately remind people of the company. But of course, the protagonist had loyal friends by his side. At this point, the presentation suddenly came to a halt, forcing him to mention that there seemed to be a minor glitch. It was unclear why the program had suddenly shut down, but the key now was not to panic and simply restart it. Most problems were solved with a simple reboot, and there was hope that this would work now. However, as if fate were mocking him, the system started an automatic update. In that moment, true panic set in, and in desperation, he tried to do anything to fix it, but the machine stubbornly refused to cooperate. As a result, some of the executives began to grumble about being forced to wait without any apparent reason. No matter how much An Yang tried to convince them to wait just a little longer, the attendees quickly grew bored. It turned out his presentation was the last one of the day, so there was no possibility of swapping places with anyone else. Because of this, the executives began to hurriedly leave the room. Only the director remained inside, still seemingly hoping to see something worth his attention. But even that didn't last long. Seeing nothing that could capture his interest, the last person who could have made a difference followed the others out. In that moment, left completely alone, the protagonist searched for a reason as to why everything had gone so wrong, and eventually concluded that this was his punishment for such impure thoughts. Yet, he also understood that giving up so easily was not an option. He needed to grasp at any opportunity, no matter how small. The chance to give a presentation had clearly passed, but he could still reformat the information and present it in written form. After all, it was a good program, and they simply had to notice it. Once he had completed that, he politely thanked the staff for allowing him to use the printer. However, it turned out that this wasn't the last thing he wanted to ask the employees. Specifically, he very much wanted to know where Director Kan's office was located. Resisting such a pleading look was simply impossible. Eventually, he found his way to one of the most important rooms in the building. The least he could do now was hand over his printouts. But even in this, An Yang was extremely nervous, fearing failure. Approaching the secretary, he asserted that he needed to show something to the director and would like to deliver it personally, or she could pass it along herself. Of course, she didn't understand the reason for his visit, but it was necessary to confirm everything with the director himself. He had to explain that he hadn't been able to present today, so he had simply printed the content in text form. In that case, the secretary pointed out that there was no chance. The director despised such things, and the mere fact that the protagonist had come here without his consent did not bode well. At that moment, someone appeared and addressed the secretary, Lim. In a panic, the woman began urging the guest to hide immediately before it was too late. The protagonist managed to conceal himself at the last second, as the boss had come to inform her that he intended to leave for the day and wouldn't be returning. Once the boss left, the secretary allowed An Yang to come out of hiding. However, for some reason, he was in no hurry to get up. As she approached, she suddenly realized that the man had started crying. The reason, it turned out, was that their team had worked tirelessly, yet he had failed to give the presentation. The sight was quite pitiful, leaving the secretary with no choice. She mentioned that she was planning to head to the restroom, and it seemed the director had forgotten to lock his office door, so perhaps he should take a closer look. After all, it might be easier to get in than it seemed. However, he clearly didn't pick up on the hint, so he agreed to watch over her desk while she was gone, hoping she would hand over the document upon her return. Finally, she had to directly tell him to leave the papers on the director's desk while she was away, as the boss always reviewed any documents left there. Though he wasn't sure if it was proper, the woman was confident this was the best way to handle the situation. Besides, she was going on maternity leave the next day, and after all, bending the rules was an effective workaround. Either he would learn to adapt to this world, or it would chew him up. If you blindly followed instructions, you'd never achieve anything. In any case, she needed to go, and An Yang would be wise not to hesitate. The protagonist, of course, followed her advice, realizing he needed to slip the information in while he still had a chance. All he had to do was place his document on the desk. There were far more documents on the desk than he had anticipated. so it wouldn't be a big deal if his paper ended up among them. However, placing it on top seemed too risky as it could end badly. But putting it at the bottom wasn't ideal either, so the best solution seemed to be mixing everything together. Soon enough, though, he realized he was acting foolishly. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a calendar with a detailed schedule. Every date was booked with something. Today, he only had the failed presentation and a bar visit, which seemed to be something personal. Whatever the case, all that was left was to pray that their project would catch the director's interest. Now Anyang felt somewhat empty. He was also anxious, wondering if everything in the document had been done correctly. These doubts quickly caught up with him, and he realized in his haste he had made quite a few mistakes. No matter how you looked at it, he had no one to blame but himself. Suddenly, the protagonist recalled that the director had planned to visit a bar tonight, and it turned out to be close by, so if he hurried, there was a chance to catch him there. Meanwhile, at the same bar, a woman was asking someone to look at the situation from a different perspective. After all, she didn't want Khan to hate her. But first, she was asked to explain the reason she wanted to break off their relationship. As it turned out, her daughter, who was now in her senior year of high school, had recently asked her mother to pay attention to her, at least this year. She hadn't said anything like that, even when the woman divorced her father or couldn't care for her because of work. Her daughter had always been understanding and supportive, but now it was serious. If she didn't listen, the girl might hold a grudge for life. The man pointed out that while the girl might be going through a tough phase, it didn't mean she had to meet every demand. However, she asked him not to be so dismissive, reminding him that he didn't have children of his own and had no idea how stressful their education system was. Besides, their relationship wasn't serious enough to put her bond with her daughter at risk. Nevertheless, Kan considered their relationship quite serious. In that case, she asked him to imagine his contract had ended and he received a great offer elsewhere. Would he really turn it down just to stay with her? In the end, it became clear they viewed life the same way and had connected because they both sought companionship without the complications of marriage. It was a bit sad that they would have to part ways, especially with someone so perfect. But her daughter was her treasure, and that was far more important than their relationship. The man had no choice but to accept this decision. And yet she remarked that even though she was the one leaving him, she'd still be upset if Khan found someone older and less attractive than her. However, he reminded her that wasn't the case. He never intentionally chose people based on their age. It just happened that those he liked were always older, and she knew that well. Changing cities didn't change his preferences. All she wanted now was a promise that next time he'd date someone under 30, as the young and inexperienced deserved a chance to be with him too. Kan didn't take her words seriously and asked her not to comfort him. He'd managed to heal his wounds on his own. In any case, all she had left to say was to ask him to take care of himself. No sooner had the woman left the bar than another visitor unexpectedly arrived, addressing the director without knowing the situation. Kan immediately recognized the young man who had failed to organize a proper presentation earlier today. Nevertheless, all he wanted to know now was how the boy had found out where to look for him. The protagonist couldn't come up with a decent excuse, so he decided to remind Khan that his day hadn't gone particularly well. That's why he came here to drown his sorrows. But as if by fate, he ran into the director, which felt like an incredibly lucky coincidence. However, if Khan had to make a bet, he'd wager it wasn't luck at all, but that someone had seen his planner. Now he wanted a clear answer. Was this the secretary's idea or his own? The protagonist, of course, didn't want to throw the woman who had helped him under the bus, so he took all the blame upon himself, admitting that he had slipped in while she was away. He confessed that it was only for a moment, but he did indeed enter and leave the overview of their program on the desk, and he would be endlessly grateful if Khan took a look at the documents. However, it turned out that it no longer mattered, as Anyang had failed to deliver the presentation. In his defense, the protagonist explained that he had no way of knowing that the system would choose to update at the worst possible moment. Looking at this young man, Khan saw determination, but no real sign of professionalism. All he could think about now were his friend's words about finding someone younger, and this guy looked to be around 22 or 23. But from the way he talked, it seemed like he was an incredibly naive person who hadn't yet experienced the realities of life. Over time, these pointless conversations only started to get on his nerves. At one point, Anyang suggested they have a drink together, but the director wasn't in the mood, and he tried to brush off the bothersome man. However, as expected, the young man was persistent and tenacious. And as it turned out, he was also bold enough to address Khan in an informal manner. Yet within seconds, the protagonist realized that his last words had been too much. So he switched to the opposite extreme, addressing Khan as if he were some kind of king. Clearly, this young man was fresh out of high school. And now he was trying to use such cheap tricks. He wasn't even good at flirting, which only made him more irritating. Finally, Anyang pointed out that even if the presentation had failed, he had compiled all the materials in written form, and their program was definitely worth a second chance. In the end, the director asked what he would get in return if he gave in and looked at the document. Perhaps, along with a drink, there would be something more. This statement caught the protagonist off guard, as it was the last thing he expected to hear. As it turned out, Kan wasn't typically interested in men. But with such a handsome face, it was easy to assume there wouldn't be any issues. So why not take a chance if the opportunity had presented itself? Seeing Anyang's reaction, Kan was sure that these crude words would do the trick and finally get the young man to leave him alone once and for all. Yet beneath that reaction lay something else. In one moment, the young man gathered his thoughts and agreed. After all, he didn't really care who he spent the night with. Meanwhile, Mina was completely immersed in the never-ending stream of work being thrown at her, making it feel like it would never end. Glancing at the time, she concluded that Anyang should have finished the presentation by now. Even without her, their program had a good chance of being selected, but there was always the possibility that things might not go according to plan. First, Kang Daehyung was exactly Anyang's type, which could lead to significant problems. Second, Khan despised bribes and under-the-table deals. At this point, the director realized that the person next to him had an astonishing lack of self-preservation. Yet there was no trace of innocence here. No matter how things played out, Mina couldn't predict the outcome based on the information she had. But it was simpler to keep the boy unaware. In the end, she reassured herself that nothing serious could happen. After all, her friend was simply incapable of botching a presentation. And even more so, he would never dare to attempt a bribe. Under no circumstances could that possibly happen. Kan couldn't tell whether his companion was improvising or if this had all been planned out. But either way, he didn't like him. And people like that needed to be put in their place, with a hard enough hit to make it clear. That's why the director pointed out that while many had tried to bribe him, offering their bodies as payment was a rarity. So the only thing left for the student now was to follow him. As expected, they went to a luxurious hotel, not some cheap love motel. The older partner also asked the younger man to buy everything they might need for the night himself. Once they arrived at the room, the host offered his guest the chance to use the shower first. In that moment, the protagonist fully realized that the man in front of him was neither a deity nor a beacon of light, just another snob, like so many others. He now truly felt like a fool for falling for him, even if only for a fleeting moment. Suddenly, the man asked how much time would be needed for preparation. This meant the director was aware that men often took time to prepare for such matters. So Anyang cautiously said 20 minutes. One stern glance was enough for Anyang to reduce that time to 15, even though he had no idea how long it actually took. However, he wasn't given the chance to head to the bathroom, as he was expected to handle it himself, before the man changed his mind, as often happened in these situations. Yet, the protagonist had no intention of backing out of this deal. He was already committed. But in reality, it wasn't about his intentions anymore. And just like that, they reached this point. Since things had gone this far, he decided to simply smile and endure whatever was about to happen, regardless of his feelings. After all, they didn't give him the time to prepare, but it didn't matter. He had little experience in these matters anyway. Even those who claimed they were the best had never lived up to their boasts, and this natural and muscular guy was honestly intimidating. Yet, despite all his worries, this man stirred up some strange emotions within him. Something was definitely off. This current partner was doing things far better than any so-called professionals. So, Anyang decided to ask directly how he had gotten so skilled if he claimed this was his first time. It turned out that a lack of interest in men didn't mean a lack of enjoyment in such activities. After all, being with men turned out to be even easier than with women. At some point, the protagonist awoke, realizing that for some reason he had actually managed to fall asleep there. It was still night outside and his partner was already getting dressed, but in any case, it was necessary to remind him about the documents now. So, he attempted to address the director. Yet for some reason, his voice kept breaking, and it felt incredibly awkward to ask about the program after what they had just done. Nevertheless, he had come too far to back down now. There was no room for doubt, and he had to let himself be a little shameless. Plastering on a businesslike smile, the protagonist reminded him about the papers. In response, the director remarked that, thanks to him, he had gained a unique experience, and it wasn't as unpleasant as he had expected, but he doubted they would ever meet again. This statement surprised the young man, as they were supposed to continue working together if the program was liked. However, Kan didn't even recall making any such promise. Confused, Anyang pointed out that, from their conversation in the bar, it had seemed clear the director had agreed. At that moment, the protagonist realized that his legs were failing to respond. The situation was becoming all too clear. The director had used him but had no intention of fulfilling anything in return. In any case, the director decided to explain how things should be done if Anyang ever wanted anything from him. Specifically, if he hoped to get something, he should file a formal request in writing, complete with signatures and copies, or better yet, record everything. And most importantly, he should throw away such dirty tactics before they led to something truly unpleasant. On that note, Director Khan left the luxurious hotel room. After that day, the protagonist fell into a deep depression. Suddenly, a familiar voice called, informing him that they had covered for him with the professor after he missed class. But now he owed them. This was rather strange, given that person had always hated him, constantly saying he was sick of seeing his face. Everything became clear when he remembered the project Mina had been working on. Apparently, this person had wanted to join their team but had been turned down, and after hearing that the team leader had left, they were eager to find out what had gone wrong. They would surely love to know the whole truth, especially since their business did indeed have some issues, namely, that the business had collapsed before it even started. The next day, the protagonist told the team everything that had happened. To his surprise, they didn't seem all that upset. They were already content just to have worked on the project. At that moment, Anyang began to question what he had been doing the entire time while his teammates had created everything, as in the end, he had contributed nothing and only ruined the final product. After losing the presentation, which had been his only task, he had even failed in his desperate attempt to sell his body. In the end, he had been tricked like a complete fool. And in all of this, Anyang blamed only himself. But right after blaming himself, he remembered he could also curse Kang Daehyung for what he had done to him, even after everything they had gone through. The entire deception, and what led to it, filled him with outrage and even bouts of hysteria. No matter how he looked at it, he had been thrown onto the bed like some object, gazed at with eyes full of disdain. For some reason, that face wouldn't leave his mind, and it truly infuriated him. Suddenly, improper thoughts of what had happened that night began swirling in his head. These thoughts horrified him because nothing good came from remembering every detail so vividly. The mere thought of it caused his anger to override his common sense. It was hard to believe he was reacting like this, especially after having been so thoroughly deceived. In the end, he realized that the harder he tried to forget that man, the more he couldn't stop thinking about him. At one point, the protagonist realized he had done something he would rather not admit to anyone. It all seemed like complete madness, something no normal person would dare to do. He tried to justify his behavior by thinking about how he had spent the entire day wallowing in his room, which led to strange thoughts entering his head. The best solution now would be to take a shower, and as it turned out, the blanket needed washing as well. The room could also use some airing out as there was a strange smell lingering inside. In the end, Anyang resolved to return to normal life. He also remembered that one of his classmates was supposed to email him the university assignment. However, to his surprise, he found an email from SJ Corporation instead. The student understood that they typically didn't write to those who had failed, which made the email all the more unexpected. As it turned out, the email contained the results of the gaming app competition for marketing. What he saw left the protagonist genuinely stunned, so much so that he couldn't believe this wasn't just the continuation of some absurd dream. He felt the need to read it again, more carefully. Sure enough, the email confirmed that they had recognized the app's alignment with the company's direction, and the proposal had been approved for further collaboration. That day, the street echoed with joyful screams. When the director returned to his office, the first thing he did was sort through the documents left for him. At one point, he came across the letter the young man had intended to give him. Just thinking about it stirred up his anger. However, despite his irritation, his curiosity got the better of him, and before tossing it away, he decided to give it a quick read. What he read evoked unexpected, yet surprisingly positive impressions. It turned out to be quite good, and if they were capable of delivering on what was described, there was also a link to the demo version, though it seemed there was a typo in the URL. Once he corrected it, the correct site appeared on his laptop. After thoroughly reviewing it, the director concluded that it was very well done and that their search for young, talented individuals had not been in vain. However, he suddenly remembered how he had parted ways with the creator of this idea. Things hadn't gone very well, and it only added more complications to his already full plate. Just then, his new secretary entered, surprised by her boss's expression, which made it seem like he was ready to unleash his fury on her very first day. In any case, she informed him that, as requested, she had printed the notice for the additional call for marketing apps, and all that was left was to get his approval. Instead, the order came to postpone the issue for the time being. Instead, she was instructed to call the executives who had attended the last briefing on the gaming app and schedule a meeting for today, which would take no more than half an hour. She already had all the contact information from the previous secretary, so she could start immediately. Eventually, the employee concluded that her new boss wasn't as harsh as she had expected, and it seemed her predecessor had been quite efficient. The previous secretary had arranged the handover of responsibilities quickly and painlessly for such a large organization. An admirable woman, though unfortunately already married. In any case, it was time to focus on her own duties. The first executive she contacted was irritated by the unscheduled meeting, as he was working remotely today. However, the woman was well aware of what the old man might be up to, so she wasn't surprised by this turn of events. Nonetheless, the director had instructed that if anyone tried to skip the meeting, not to pressure them unnecessarily. A simple list of those who refused to attend would suffice, though usually everyone showed up. Finally, she informed the executive that it was fine if he couldn't make it. Though judging by his tone, he had something important to say, and in her opinion, it would be worth attending. Though with clear reluctance, the executive agreed to attend. This reaction suggested that the old-timers were genuinely afraid of Kang Daehyung. In the end, the entire directorate showed up for the meeting, though no one had expected them all to attend at the outset. At the end of the meeting, the director asked his secretary to play the necessary video. The video featured the now familiar tofu logo. The executives remembered that this was the same presentation that hadn't been shown, and they were slightly annoyed at being shown unfinished material again, and without a speaker this time. However, everyone present agreed that what they saw was quite charming. It took only 30 seconds for the dissatisfaction to fade from their faces. It was clear they had been gathered just to gauge the reaction of the leadership. The presentation was brief, and the developers were not mentioned. Yet discussions were already starting among the attendees about downloading the app. Finally, Director Khan addressed everyone, with the announcement that their new marketing app would be developed in collaboration with this very team.